Yeah, Vic loves that, but
It's on my side. Yeah, I mean, I would say that I say that in jest. Of course, we're poring over numbers all the time, trying to make things work, but we're not trying to make them not work.
Yeah.
That's the difference. Like we will do anything to make it work, which is, I was sitting at this NPN
National Performance Network.
VAN, Visual Art Network mid-year meeting, and we were having a conversation about, capacity building and all these things. And at the end of our discussion, all of us, representatives from major institutions that present visual art all over the country said, our models are not sustainable.
Yeah.
And how do we hide that from all the foundations? Because again, but that's, the system is set up for us to dodge that question quite a bit. Otherwise, none of this would come into being because it just seems impossible.
There are certain things where the sort of monetary line in the sand of saying this is the top threshold, dream to that thing, can create a lot of creativity. It can. There's also systems in which that behavior will devastate an artistic vision, right?
right.
Dream to, it's like asking
Put a top on something.
you put it's a way of saying no. It's a way of actually revealing that your belief in them, the possibility, the community that will receive it, that you believe that at a certain threshold it will be okay, and beyond that it can't be. And any artist worth their salt is going to go beyond that threshold, and then you're left revealing and having played the card that your belief has limitations, and therefore theirs should too. And that's what you work against inside of your system, every chance you get, I think.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah. Kristy, also, we're talking here and in this exhibition, there's a lot of wall work.
Yes.
We're talking about, we're using the term visual art, which
Yeah.
we use, or you're saying, you were hired initially at the museum to do a performance program. Could you talk about this idea of interdisciplinarity, or whether a divide between forms is necessary, how it prevents us maybe from participating on either side, or maybe what you've seen it with artists and whether or not they care about the distinction or not?
Well, some do and some don't. I mean, there's, certain painters, it's about that. It is absolutely about that, right? Or photographers, it's absolutely about that. And every bit of getting your hands in the material, or sculptors, or a variety of other things. But it doesn't mean that the aesthetic ideas are not informed by other things. I was doing a huge project at the Armory with Tom Sachs. It was this big thing where he was basically recreating the lunar landing and a variety of other things through discarded materials and then turning them into the lamb. At any rate, whenever I'd be at his studio and we'd be working on it, he had two things going on. One was he had a countdown timer to the date of the opening at the Armory. So for like 2.5 years, he was looking at the time passing, and it pressurized the whole studio constantly. And that was a kind of performative element of what was going on in the studio. But the other thing that he did was he listened to James Brown music, like obsessively. So I can look at his sculptures and hear James Brown music. And I'm not kidding. So, for him, in a way, it was like, this is soul, this is jazz, this is, this sculpture is that. So these discipline boundaries, I think that human beings, we like to have really tidy categories, and then subcategories, and beyond subcategories, and then pinpoints onto one thing, right? And I don't know why we do it, but we clearly like to do it. And artists tend to not really like that, right? Or the ability, when I was curating with PICA, one of the things that was interesting to me was that I had no really deep connection, almost probably to a fault, to there was a certain kind of architecture, and only that architecture would be where this kind of work would live, right? Clearly, you need some architecture for some of these things. But I was framing some of the visual art in relation to performance, which continues, and it's led by artists. It's not that you go, oh, let's break down some discipline boundaries by whacking you all together and see if a dog's breakfast can emerge. It's them being very interested and passionate in collaborating across, and artists that I'd worked with and who had collaborated with me here taught me that very, very clearly. Nanda D'Agostino and others, it was like the collaborative practice is part of building a community around a working idea. But in that, like I had brought in Akram Khan, choreographer, at the time, who had been in collaboration with Anish Kapoor. There was many other kinds of choreographies that this young choreographer at the time was making. And it's not like he had this giant household name. And at the time too, I remember Anish Kapoor certainly had a name, but not really much of a footprint in any way here. I wasn't going to be in a situation where I could, transpose some giant sculptural object into the world order. But I knew that the depth of that integrity of his practice was going to read inside of this work. So the framing of it to me was very much a framing of an exhibition, but the exhibition of that work stood on a stage, and it involved choreographic language, musical language, tradition, palette, pigment, and a variety of other things. So Anish has obviously gone on to massive amounts of things, but the visual community here at that time didn't see that, right? Or when I was working with Shirin Nishat, that was around a huge commission, and it involved also Philip Glass. So there was a framing of how visual artists' work was being held in the exhibition programs that were connected to performances, and then there were the exhibitions themselves, right?
And how has that evolved? I mean, now you curate many different things, but specifically at UCLA, it's mostly performance and music. Do you see things emerging from that side, or what do you think your role is as a curator putting together a season as opposed to an exhibition? Does the same thing emerge, or a festival? Is there that one artist that gives you the idea?
Yeah, and also place. Place informs me so much. So like the place of LA, being from the great Pacific Northwest and being taught to dislike Los Angeles, California, where I now live, and love. There was a lot that I could read. You learn to read in a city, and you learn to read a place. And then it's about figuring out how to intuitively move a lot towards that place in that time. And for whatever reason, I tend to be able to quickly understand convention, as we all can, and familiarity. And then the question becomes, how much capacity do we have for the discovery of that which might be new? And so in the context of that, for example, I work a lot, museum colleagues and the visual art world in Los Angeles, as you know, it's huge, it's an important city. There's lots and lots and lots going on, and there's been a ton of curatorial attention, as well as commercial gallery attention, as well as collectors, as well. So it's quite fecund, but it took a long time for the city to emerge its practice in a way that made it significant. Performance, however, has been very weak there, except for commercial, music is strong, theater and dance is really weak. You might as well be in Boise, Idaho in some cases. It's true, but that's changing because so many artists are coming in. But the way in which those forms read there are very different. And there hasn't been a lot of curatorial presenter attention in those forms. So because I've been lucky enough to work across all of these different institutions and forms, I collaborate a lot with the Hammer Art Museum. I just did a huge project with LACMA last week. The project that I did, River of Fundament, with Matthew Barney's newest piece, which is the first sort of major cinematic work he's done post-Cremaster. He's done a lot of installations, a variety of other things, but this was, it took him 6 years to get this thing to happen. And it's a 6.5-hour sort of cinematic sculptural opera. Jonathan Beppler had done the score. And it needed the architecture of a proscenium kind of opera house, which I have access to. So that's where we worked on that framing. And that ended up becoming a collaboration that I'd initiated because Matthew asked if I would, frankly. And then I brought the Hammer Museum in, and they reran all of the Cremaster. It was like a marathon of the Cremaster series. San Francisco Museum of Modern Art had also, because they have a large exhibition practice with him, did a piece on their virtual site that was connected to it. And then MoCA, LA MoCA, Philippe Verne, the new director there, will do the exhibition of all of the sculptural objects that were where this cinema was taking place. And so it's, I mean, it will be massive.
Huge.
So Hammer and MoCA, it's not like they're best friends or anything, you know. So the likelihood of them joining arms together would not have been high, but the likelihood of them joining arms together through the Center for the Art of Performance doing something then creates this triangulated way of addressing an artist's capacity in that city, as well as his gallery owner, which I also have less of those kind of conflicts of interest between a museum and a commercial student gallery space, which they can exist, as you know. But in a performance world, that is not quite the same. So a lot could happen to ultimately amplify the dimensionality, emergence, and continuing fascination that this artist has for the way in which he approaches many different art forms as a practice. So those kinds of things, you know, I did a big project with the Getty Museum in which it was connected to Trisha Brown's retrospective. And with Trisha Brown, you're going to be looking at Dan Flavin's pieces, you're going to be looking at, I mean, so many of the decors that are coming out of it, Rauschenberg, so on and so forth. So there was all of that work going on through the retrospective, but some of her site-specific pieces, which involved choreography on the rooftops of buildings, we restaged. And that was the one that I naively went to the Getty and said, hey, I've got a great idea. How about if we let these dancers dance on top of your building, all your buildings? And so they said yes, and for a year and a half we endeavored to do it, and then it happened. So it probably would never happen again, but it happened, right? And so there's a way in which utilizing the institutions as frames to hold work and to develop collaborative exchange can then become a way of creating multiple ladder points for different kinds of audiences and their value systems to find and cross these discipline boundaries because of the gesture.
It's exciting.
Sorry, I banged on about that a long time.
Well, I'm going to ask Kristan a question
Yeah.
because, and then we can open it up for conversation from the audience. So, I mean, you're bringing artists, so you were bringing artists like Kapoor and Dinky Lay before they were known, and you're bringing artists now that are not known.
Yeah.
How do you build an audience in a smaller city? How, you know, with what you're doing?
Take a sip of water
I
first.
know. First, I'm going to say something that's unpopular and say that you can't think about the audience, really, in the beginning. Because you have to be in conversation with the artist, ask them what they want to do next. That's the way I stop myself from being scared about a big idea. I just say what's next and listen for a little bit, and then that gets my brain working about what we can do. As I think a lot of times with the kind of meager economy that PICA works with, it would be very easy to say, you know, to contract and be like, we're not going to be able to pull that off. But when an artist says, like when I worked with Caleb Lindsay and I'm sitting in his little apartment and he says, I want to make a new animation. I've been working with an intern who's like going to school and and I said, oh, animation. I know Kirk Kelly, who's on our board, and he is at LICA, and maybe he'll want to meet Caleb and help out.
Yeah.
And so I start thinking about the resources we do have before I even think about who is going to like the piece or the artist or how it responds.
Yeah.
And then I think that we have a big, there's an I in our name that's Institute. And we have a big commitment to contextualizing work. And so whenever we present something, there's an engagement moment, a learning moment. It might not look like a traditional program at another institution, but there are ways that people can interact. And one of the biggest ways an audience, there's many different levels, but the audience comes to work is through being a part of making the piece. So a lot of the projects that I'm bringing require, the energy from many different points of participation, and that starts spreading out. And then there's the eventual display. And I think part of the eventism and excitement around the TBA Festival has helped bring some communities together that never would have come together. And I was talking to Kristy last night about our, dilemma in finding, the perfect space for TBA this year, and how incredible it's been to have the works and visual art, major installations side by side.
Yeah.
Part of it is that they're open at night.
Yeah.
So, it's a total different audience dynamic at that moment.
Yeah.
Part of it is they're coming to see, a DJ from Brazil, but they wander into Jennifer West's installation or Mesher's installation, and suddenly they're in a whole other place. So maybe, destabilizing an audience expectation would be more what I'm after than going or pandering to an audience to get a specific end. I mean, anytime I've tried to do that, it's failed. When I get too in my head about something, like I made an exhibition once that I thought was about like dystopic visions of the world is crumbling, but it was also the first year we were in Washington High School, and the second people walked in there, they were running around like giddy teenagers. So the audience changed the dynamic of that work.
Yeah.
It's dystopia! They celebrated this work that was like really like work that was painful and heavy for a lot of the artists. And I had put this big heavy label on top of it, and then everybody tore it apart. So I found it's better to trust that curious people are going to meet you or meet the artist at a certain place. And I learned that from Kristy and all of the other women who work at PICA, and that's how we do.
That's great. Wow, that's very informative.
Well, yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
I remember when we switched also at PICA from an annual program, intermittent exhibitions, if we could get our hands on a space and so on and so forth, before we ended up having, for a while, an actual space program, which had its own challenges. But then collapsing a performance season, as it were, into this 10-day international festival. And one of the things that was really interesting for me, with the exception of some of the people like a Leslie Durst who really stood behind things, was that when I would end up in a foundation, because by then we were definitely asking foundations for support, when I would go in and try and find support for the season itself, a season of work, an annual program of work, the question line would follow, who is on it? And then it's fishing for something that will be recognized, right?
Or who's the big name? We get that question
Yeah,
still
who's
to
the
this
big
day.
name? Yeah.
Who's the headliner?
Who's the headliner? Who's the big name? So you're having this kind of conversation, and if you're a curator, you're just screwed, because then you start talking. You'll say kind of something that you think is going to be likely familiar. I remember saying Spalding Gray at the time, and crickets on the receiving end. And I thought, oh my God, I'm doomed, because it's like Rhode Island and some other people after that. So if that's not happening, I am truly doomed. Truly doomed. And so if that didn't click into some inherent immediate resonance or knowledge, which it shouldn't necessarily have to, then you start describing their practice. Now this, as you might imagine, is worse than doom. Because now you are going down the rabbit hole of relevance in the art world in a way that the person who doesn't even know who you're talking about is going to be like, help me get this person off. Right? So what happened is that when we shifted and we made a calculated decision to shift into this 10-day compressed, international festival, no one asked me who was on it. They said, what is it going to be like? And the shift of that question changed absolutely everything. What is it going to be like? Because in that way you can describe that part of what something will be like is about the use of a city, is about a place, is about a convergence point, is about functioning like a magnet, is about investing in the belief of the identity of here. All these different kinds of things. And that shift, we try to endeavor to do that in every way we can. Not who is it, seeking for that which is familiar and being considered unvalid if you can't find the familiar, right? Because the potency of leaning forward towards discovery is a very different kind of dynamic, right? So you're in this thing where the looking for that which is familiar may create a docking mechanism. And everything that we're trying to do is say the process of tilling the soil in such a way that people can come together and be wrapped and provoked and disrupted through the process of discovery is the gift endeavor we're seeking to put in that ground. It's the gift endeavor of that possibility, to lean forward differently towards that which is other and not known, and look forward to it. So it's so much the process of how do you suspend total disbelief that any of this can even make sense to anyone, and not fall into a trap of only exploiting and extracting value from that which is familiar, to build new possibilities so that that which is not yet even made has a home and a creative life in a place through the practice of that weave.
Wow, I think that says it all. Thank you, Kristy.